When most people think of September the 11th, their minds naturally go to the tragic events that shook America in 2001, from New York to Washington, D.C. However, a decade later, a different attack, this time some 5,000 miles from the United States, would come to dominate the American political scene for years to come. As night fell on September the 11th, 2012, armed militants linked to al-Qaeda stormed a poorly defended US consulate hastily established in Benghazi, Libya, following the revolution that had toppled longtime dictator Muammar Gaddafi. The events of that night would send Americans stationed there into a desperate fight for survival. Ultimately, the US ambassador and several other American security personnel lost their lives. The response to the attack quickly devolved into bitter political disputes, with the truth of what actually occurred becoming obscured by partisan attacks. Now, more than a decade later, we can look back and piece together the real story of what unfolded on that fateful night. Muammar Gaddafi had ruled Libya with an iron grip since 1969. As brutal as he was unpredictable, he routinely jailed or executed dissidents and maintained strict control over the country's considerable oil wealth. Unsurprisingly, this resulted in a stagnant economy with few opportunities for ordinary Libyans. On the international stage, Gaddafi gained notoriety for sponsoring terrorist organizations, notably his regime's involvement in the 1988 Lockerbie bombing, which rendered Libya a pariah among nations. In many ways, Libya became the North Korea of Africa. This status quo collapsed during the First Libyan Civil War in 2011, which unfolded as part of the wider Arab Spring. Across the Middle East, people rose up against authoritarian rulers who had clung to power for decades. From Cairo to Tunis, it seemed that no dictator was safe. US foreign policy at the time strongly favored pro-democracy movements, supporting the revolutions that toppled Hosni Mubarak in Egypt and others across the region. The narrative that a region long dismissed as backward and anti-democratic was finally ready to embrace liberal democracy, and that proved hard to resist for many in the West. The strongmen that rebels opposed made for poor symbols to rally behind. Repressive dictators who had presided over largely impoverished nations, enriching only themselves and their inner circles. Ultimately, the US and other NATO members intervened on behalf of the rebels in Libya. Until this point, it had been unclear who would come out ahead, but once the bombs started falling, Gaddafi's forces quickly went on the retreat. City after city across Libya began to fall into rebel hands. By the time the rebels stormed the capital city of Tripoli, it was all but over for Gaddafi's regime. After the collapse of the Gaddafi regime, Libya found itself in an all-too-familiar situation. The removal of a strongman dictator who had held the country together by brute force left behind a chaotic power vacuum. This vacuum gave rise to a broad array of fighters. Many of these individuals were genuinely supportive of democracy and would go on to play a crucial role in supporting the US presence in the country. Others, however, had far more nefarious intentions. Take Ansar al-Sharia, for example. This group was a Salafi jihadist militia with clear ideological and operational ties to al-Qaeda. It outright rejected the idea of democratic governance, instead advocating for strict adherence to Sharia law. Their black and white flag, eerily familiar to anyone following Middle Eastern affairs, soon began to fly brazenly across cities outside the provisional government's control. Chief among these was the Libyan city of Benghazi. On the night of September the 11th, 2012, Ambassador Stevens was trying to keep a low profile at a hastily arranged diplomatic outpost in Benghazi. Tensions ran high due to the anniversary of 9/11, a date when Islamist militants were known to stage attacks as a perverse form of celebration. Further complicating matters was the overall deteriorating security situation in the city. US State Department intelligence had warned of imminent attacks from Ansar al-Sharia and other Islamist groups operating in the area. Against this backdrop, Ambassador Stevens was advised not to leave the compound. However, given the speed with which the outpost had been established, its temporary nature, and the fact that it lacked official embassy status, calling its security light would be like saying Joker 2 was slightly misconceived. It was an almost award-winning understatement. Most US embassies are guarded by at least one Marine security detachment, typically consisting of 10 to 20 highly trained Marines tasked with defending the outpost at all cost. These Marines usually operate within a heavily fortified compound complete with high, blast-proof walls and watchtowers. The consulate in Benghazi had none of these essential defenses. There was no Marine security guard, no blast-resistant walls, and no heavily fortified safe haven with an independent ventilation system. Instead, the outpost was protected only by an 8-foot-high wall and a small group of 5 diplomatic security personnel. With this minimal security infrastructure, the consulate depended heavily on local Libyan security forces. In short, defending such a location was a logistical nightmare, almost impossible without Libyan support. At 9:42 p.m. local time, the first shots rang out. About 20 to 40 attackers had gathered outside the main gate, heavily armed with AK-47s, RPGs, hand grenades, and heavy machine guns. The local security guards, who lacked both proper training and advanced weaponry, immediately fled as the attack began. With no defensive towers and the front security team gone, storming the compound was no longer just easy, it was cakewalk. Immediately, the top priority was to secure the ambassador inside the semi-fortified safe haven located in Villa C. Along with Ambassador Stevens, DS Scott Strickland and Information Management Officer Sean Smith quickly sealed themselves inside. An urgent call for reinforcements was sent to a CIA station just a mile away. The safe haven within the compound was a defensive room designed to keep out attackers. It featured bars on the windows and reinforced bulletproof doors. However, it was constructed to withstand only limited assaults, typically from thieves or lightly armed groups, and lacked the advanced features of a safe haven in a fully equipped embassy, most notably an independent ventilation system. This critical oversight would ultimately prove to be the compound's vulnerability. After overrunning the consulate, the attackers swiftly located the safe haven, easily identifying it by its imposing, seemingly impenetrable doors. Believing the ambassador was inside, they began attempting to force entry. All the ambassador and a small security detail could do was watch a live video feed of the attackers gathering just outside their fortified room. The team frantically scrambled to radio for assistance. Aside from the small CIA annex just down the street, the nearest help was nearly 400 miles away in Tripoli on the other side of the country. Within 20 minutes of receiving the distress call, highly trained ex-Special Forces personnel set out for the consulate at around 10 p.m. local time, fully aware they were heading into a life-or-death situation. Back at the compound, the attackers repeatedly kicked and shot at the door but failed to breach the barrier. Undeterred, they knew they had to take more drastic measures. If they couldn't get into the ambassador, they would force him out. Still confined to the safe haven, Ambassador Stevens could only watch in horror as the attackers began bringing in canister after canister of diesel fuel. It became frighteningly clear what was about to happen, and those inside were powerless to stop it. One by one, the attackers emptied the canisters throughout the complex, splashing fuel on the walls and furniture. And then, at roughly 10:05 p.m., they lit a match. The safe haven, lacking both fireproofing and an isolated ventilation system, stood no chance against this new onslaught. The building, and soon after the entire complex, was engulfed in flames. The scene resembled something from a medieval painting of hell. Thick, black smoke rapidly filled the safe haven. It became immediately clear that the very room designed to protect them from attackers would become their grave if they did not flee. The exact events that unfolded over the next several minutes remain unclear, even after more than a decade. With dense black smoke flooding their refuge, the three men were left with only one option. They had to attempt an escape. At 10:25 p.m., GRS forces arrived from the nearby CIA compound. By this time, flames had overtaken much of what was once Villas C and B. The front gate had been breached, allowing both opportunistic looters and curious local civilians to enter the compound. The remaining attackers were not in uniform, making it impossible for GRS to distinguish friend from foe. Upon entry, the team came under immediate fire. Shots rang out from multiple directions and buildings. The February 17th Brigade, a group of friendly Libyans, had been assigned to protect the compound, but had allegedly fled. Were some still present, though? Was this friendly fire, or were these the attackers? It was chaos. Nevertheless, the GRS pressed forward. The attackers, some of whom had already begun to flee after the fires broke out, were taken by surprise by the speed and force of the American reinforcements. Within minutes, the attackers abandoned the compound to regroup. The GRS forces reached Villa C, where they had last heard Ambassador Stevens was taking shelter at 10:30 p.m. There, they met up with DS Strickland, who had managed to escape through a bathroom window inside the safe haven. He thought Ambassador Stevens and DS Smith were behind him, but he had lost both of them in the confusion and near zero visibility caused by the smoke inside. Battling intense heat and thick smoke from the ongoing fires, GRS and DS agents made several determined attempts to enter Villa C and locate the ambassador. Without exchanging a word, they all recognized the bitter truth. No one could have survived these conditions. This was confirmed when they discovered the body of DS Smith, who would later be found to have died from smoke inhalation. Despite their repeated efforts, the team was unable to find the ambassador. With the building at risk of immediate collapse, they were ultimately, though reluctantly, forced to withdraw from Villa C. All the while, they knew the militants were regrouping, and every extra moment spent increased the risk of another ambush on the already vulnerable compound. After conducting a rapid sweep of the other two villas to ensure no one was left behind, the team pulled out of the compound entirely and made their way back to the annex. On their way back, they knew the attackers were not finished. After scoring such a massive victory by raiding a US consulate, the enemy would surely return. By 11:30, less than 2 hours after the attack began, all surviving American personnel had gathered at the CIA annex. The situation was grim. The ambassador had almost certainly been either killed or kidnapped, which could have been worse, but no one could say for sure. The consulate was completely destroyed, and D.S. Smith's body lay in the back of one of their vans. The February 17th militia, which was supposed to provide security for the compound, had all but disappeared. It wasn't until they reached the annex, however, that they fully realized how alone they were. The GRS team was made up of ex-Special Forces veterans, men who had completed multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. In those wars, the US military had been able to deploy significant reinforcements. Armed drones, Apache attack helicopters, and bombers were available for crises like this. Backup might not have always arrived immediately, but in both countries, or when you called for reinforcements, they came. Libya presented a completely different situation. The fall of the Gaddafi regime had left the country fractured, with no strong central authority. Militias were running rampant, and there was essentially zero US military presence inside Libya or any of its neighboring countries. There was a small team of 6 Americans in Tripoli who had been dispatched, but there was no telling when they would arrive. The best rapid response available was an unarmed Predator drone for aerial surveillance. This was not due to a lack of attention once the attack began, however. While there had been serious security missteps in the lead-up, Washington was alert as the events unfolded. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Martin Dempsey were notified within 50 minutes of the attack. Panetta soon ordered 2 Marine platoons in Spain to prepare for deployment and instructed a special operations team in Europe, as well as another in the US, to get ready to stage. The issue was not a lack of response, but rather a lack of preparation. Now, you might think that CIA hideouts are supposed to be top secret, and in theory you'd be absolutely right, but in Libya, things rarely go according to plan. Locals had long suspected that something was off about the place. With its high walls, guard towers, and the ever-present guard stationed at the gate, it was a glaring red flag that something unusual was happening there. Add to that the constant stream of Westerners coming and going from the compound, and it didn't take a rocket scientist to put 2 and 2 together. Remember, post-revolution Benghazi was hardly a hotspot for tourists. While people may not have known it was specifically a CIA outpost, even local civilians had started calling it the American compound. In other words, the team in the annex knew the attackers were coming for them. Despite repeated attempts to reach out to Libyan brigade commanders, it quickly became clear that reinforcements would not arrive anytime soon. Meanwhile, the 6-man team, Team Tripoli, had landed in Benghazi but was stuck at the airport without Libyan transportation. The lack of an American presence in the country meant they were entirely dependent on the Libyans for armored vehicles. Security for the team remained the top priority. They would be of no help to anyone if they were ambushed and pinned down in one of Benghazi's infamously narrow winding streets. Inside the annex, it was all hands on deck. The team sandbagged rooftops and strategically positioned their limited firepower to ensure 360-degree surveillance, making themselves as ready for the siege as possible. Overhead, their only tangible backup since the attack began was a single unarmed drone providing surveillance. Washington was watching. They were just powerless to intervene. By the time the clock struck midnight, a heavy silence had settled around the annex. It was too quiet. Although the area was home to a CIA outpost and there were other civilian buildings nearby, everything around them had gone dark. GRS officer Chris Tanto Peranto later described the feeling. It got quiet. You could feel it. Everyone disappeared, like they knew what was about to happen. And then they saw movement. First one figure, then another, and another. Bodies crept slowly and low to the ground, making their way toward the annex. It was difficult to tell their exact numbers, but there were easily more than 24. This time, however, the Americans had the advantage. Unlike the consulate, which had been described as a sniper's paradise, the annex was far better defended. The earlier attack on the consulate had caught everyone off guard, and its security had collapsed almost immediately as the Libyan militia members fled. That wasn't going to happen here. Friendly Libyan support had failed to materialize, leaving only the highly trained US soldiers to defend the annex, but this time they were ready and alert for the assault that they knew was coming. Contrary to what you might expect, they actually allowed the attackers to get relatively close to the compound. That was a strategic decision. Opening fire too soon would have revealed their position through the muzzle flash. They knew they only had one chance at this, so when they did decide to open fire, they wanted to be deadly accurate and eliminate the attackers as quickly as possible. Once the firing began, it took little time to neutralize the enemy. Although the attackers returned fire, their lack of training and their inferior, mostly looted firearms, many of which were remnants from ex-Gaddafi strongholds and leftovers from the Soviet era, meant they failed to hit a single American target. They were completely caught off guard by the advanced defenses of the annex and quickly retreated. You would think that by this point, the United States military would have been able to mobilize some form of support for them. Yet, even after everything that had happened, they remained essentially alone. The Marine force ordered to deploy from Spain was bogged down in a bureaucratic mess and had not even taken off yet. The rules of engagement were unclear, as the Marines were not formally authorized by the provisional Libyan government to deploy. There was confusion over whether they should wear civilian clothing or full combat uniforms. This seemingly trivial detail became a major obstacle on legal grounds, with the team being ordered to change in and out of uniform multiple times before deploying. At the same time, armed drones were more limited than they are today, with most of them deployed in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, out of range of Benghazi. Around this time, news reports began to circulate that an American had been brought to a Libyan hospital alive. Immediately, both hope and panic swept over the staff in the annex. This had to be Ambassador Stevens, they thought. They were relieved at the prospect that he was alive, yet simultaneously panicked, as they themselves were fighting for their lives in a heavily fortified compound. Leaving on a rescue mission to a hospital across the city would have been a death sentence for everyone. Now, these initial reports turned out to only be partially accurate. The American in question was indeed Stevens. Concerned local Libyan civilians had searched the compound after the attack in hopes of finding any American survivors. They carried the ambassador to the hospital, where medical staff attempted to revive him for over 90 minutes. However, what the reports had gotten wrong was that he was still alive. He'd likely passed away before ever reaching the hospital and was pronounced dead there from smoke inhalation after resuscitation efforts failed. Team Tripoli, meanwhile, remained grounded on the tarmac. Operating in a foreign country without any military presence meant they had no armored ground units to transport them. The militias themselves were hastily organized, and assembling armored convoys to secure Americans in a city that was swiftly falling into the hands of al-Qaeda-linked groups was going to take time. By 5 a.m., the sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon. The Annex had just fought off another wave of attacks and had no idea when the next might arrive. With daylight, however, came the first good news since the attacks began. Team Tripoli had finally arrived. It had taken hours, but they managed to organize a convoy of friendly Libyan militia brigades to escort them from the airport. The newfound hope would not last long, though. Less than 15 minutes after their arrival, a deafening explosion rocked the Annex, then another and another. This was different from the previous waves of attack. It wasn't gunfire, it was mortar shells raining down on the compound. The first mortar landed just outside the walls, but their accuracy quickly improved. The second and third strikes were direct hits to the rooftop where Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty were positioned, both men being killed instantly. DS Dave Ubin, who was on the rooftop, was thrown by the blast, his leg mutilated and his body riddled with shrapnel. It was now clear that holding the compound was no longer tenable. Fending off a ragtag coalition of rebels armed with Soviet-era Kalashnikovs was one thing, but there was simply no way to prevent more mortar shells from raining down on them. They had to leave, and they had to leave now. The team hurriedly evacuated the compound, climbing into the Libyan shield vehicles that had brought Team Tripoli only minutes earlier, all while under threat of more mortars and gunfire. Armed to the teeth, they braced for one final ambush that miraculously never came. Within the hour, the entire team had arrived safely at Benghazi's airport. Despite another setback caused by their dependence on Libyan personnel and aircraft for transportation, the team eventually got wheels up on a flight from Benghazi to Tripoli, grateful to be alive. It didn't take long for the events of September the 11th, 2012 to become politicized. They would spark years of investigations and congressional hearings, but now, nearly a decade and a half later, we can look back with greater clarity on how things actually unfolded. At the time, US intelligence significantly underestimated the growth of Islamist extremist groups in Benghazi. This became evident as the attack unfolded. However, the Obama administration did itself no favors in the days that followed. Despite CIA intelligence indicating that groups such as Ansar al-Sharia were responsible, the White House repeatedly described the incident as an organic, civilian-led protest that spiraled out of control in response to an anti-Islamic film posted to YouTube just days earlier, which insulted the Prophet Muhammad. Although the film did indeed spark protests elsewhere in the Middle East, this explanation largely missed the mark in Benghazi. None of the attackers at the compound were carrying signs or appeared to be participating in any protest. Ultimately, it took the administration 9 days to acknowledge that this was not a spontaneous demonstration, but rather a well-planned and coordinated act of terrorism. The reason behind this long-held insistence remains unclear, especially given that internal intelligence never suggested the attack was the result of protests. One theory posits that the administration was worried about appearing to have dropped the ball on national security in the lead-up to an election year, but this stance would eventually prove detrimental. Republicans, meanwhile, were quick to seize on the opportunity to portray President Obama and, later in 2016, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, as weak on national security. A persistent rumor circulated that a stand-down order had been given to the GRS, preventing them from leaving the CIA annex to rescue the ambassador, though no evidence for this ever surfaced. The lessons from Benghazi, they're more complex. than they might first appear. In hindsight, it's clear that a US ambassador should never have been left with such minimal security in a country experiencing recurring waves of post-revolution violence. Reinforcements were stationed too far away to be deployed in a timely manner, and armed drones were unavailable. This created a perfect storm, a US military dead zone, so to speak. While no direct stand-down order was given, the CIA station chief opted to rely more on local Libyan security than hindsight would later deem wise. Once the Mayday call came in from the consulate reporting that they were under attack, the station chief insisted on coordinating with Libyan militias before deploying the GRS team to rescue Ambassador Stevens. This decision resulted in a roughly 20-minute delay, a delay that GRS team members later strongly believed made the crucial difference, causing them to arrive at the consulate after the ambassador had been killed. The Benghazi attack was a tragedy shaped by chaos, miscalculation, poor preparation, and delayed decisions. 4 Americans died not because of a single failure, but because of a chain of them: strategic, logistical, and political. The lessons to be drawn from this are clear. In volatile regions, security must never be an afterthought. The truth, however uncomfortable, should always be pursued and never twisted for political gain. Thank you for watching.